Well, welcome to session 3 of the Art of City Building, and we're going to go right away to the Member of Parliament for Halifax, Mr. Andy Fillmore.
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. It's Andy Fillmore here, the MP in Halifax, where I'm coming to you live from my home. I also have the great privilege of being Parliamentary Secretary to Canada's Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, Catherine McKenna. But I'll say that first and always, I'm a city planner and urban designer, so it's such a thrill to spend today with a group of dedicated and forward-thinking planners and city builders and placemakers and people who care, who have done so much to build better communities in Canada and around the world. But first, I want to acknowledge for those of us joining from the Maritimes that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, or Mi'kmaqi, where we are all treaty people. So this afternoon, we're all excited to hear from these amazing panelists, some of whom are dear friends, and others are dear friends waiting to be made, on the topic of placemaking. Now, this is of great interest to me, not just from my past career as a city planner, but also as the first city planner elected to the Parliament of Canada. What took so long, I have no idea, but I have to tell you, I'm really, really happy to be there now. So I'd like to say a special thanks to Karash and all of the organizers for another great AOCB. They understand intimately that the notion of community is the very foundation of human civilization, and so that the kind of places that we make when we build our communities are fundamentally consequential to the health and happiness, the fair treatment, and the prosperity of all the people who live there. Now, as placemakers, whether we're hired or elected or whether we volunteer, our task is to make our communities feel like home by thinking big, by engaging with and authentically listening to the people that we serve, and by acting with all the dedication and perseverance that's required to get good stuff done. And sometimes you have to dig pretty deep. And this brings me to a federal initiative that I worked on over the spring and summer called the Canada Healthy Communities Initiative. It was born out of the depths of the first wave of the pandemic, when planners were being asked, and in fact we're asking ourselves, how can communities across Canada find the opportunity in this pandemic to build back better, to rethink how our communities have served us in the past and what they can become tomorrow to meet the challenges of this moment, and also to improve the quality of life beyond this moment. And one of the answers to this question that Catherine McKenna and I came up with is the Canadian Healthy Communities Initiative. This is an initiative that will invest $31 million in federal funds to help support community-driven solutions that will improve residents' quality of life and help communities to build back better. There are 3 streams under which projects will be funded as Canadians return to their daily routines. The first is creating safe and vibrant public spaces. The second is supporting active transportation options. And the third is advancing digital solutions that help us to adapt to our new normal as that emerges. So with this new initiative, communities could, for example, expand community gardens to provide healthy, affordable food. They could install free Wi-Fi hotspots in public spaces so that more people can get online and get connected in a democratic way. It could fund pop-up projects for new bike lanes, for wider sidewalks, to allow people to get outdoors while practicing safe social distancing. And it can refit and retrofit public spaces to allow our Main Street businesses to expand their footprint in small and creative ways that allow them to recover economically. Now, placemakers know what a difference projects like these can make in a neighborhood, and the opportunities are immense. Last week, an open call was issued so that we can identify eligible, non-governmental, not-for-profit organizations to administer the fund. So if your organization is interested, or if you know of an organization that would be perfect for this, the application deadline is coming up soon, October 16th. After that, applications will open for local applicants seeking funding for their grassroots placemaking projects. There's a lot more info at infrastructure.gc.ca, or you can catch up with me anytime. I'm easy to find. So thank you for your kind attention. Now let's get into the placemaking session with these incredible panelists. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Fillmore. And we all know that politicians are never ones to turn down invitations to speak. But I will say, before his current job, Andy was a great city planner. I had the pleasure of working with him here in Halifax. Did some great work together. A pleasure to work with. And he really is one of those folks that's on our side. He's been a big supporter of this conference since day one. So welcome to session 3. My name is Paul MacKinnon, and by day, I'm the CEO of the Downtown Halifax Business Commission. We're a business improvement district here in Halifax, one of 9 in our beautiful city. And I'm also one of the co-founders of this event, The Art of City Building. And I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I'm very pleased to be in a room with the other co-founders. You can't see them, but they're here behind my screen. We're kind of gathered, spatially distanced in a room here together. So it's almost like a little mini conference, and excited to be joined from people from across Canada, across the US, and indeed from around the world. So this is the 3rd session from today. It's entitled Inclusive Placemaking and Development. So in a conversation we had last week, we were speaking with Julian Agerman, who is one of our speakers from the earlier session today. An amazing session. If you missed it, you will be able to get a recording of that. He made the observation that no one goes into city planning with bad intentions. Most of us are involved with planning and placemaking in some way. Certainly, every one of us is impacted by it. And we need to be humble enough to acknowledge that, things like today's best planning, it may become tomorrow's mistake. Good plans may still be the result of poor planning consultation processes, right? Good development may still displace people. Systemic racism is often overt, but oftentimes it is simply perpetuated when well-intentioned people are building off of past mistakes and don't really know how to fix them. Anyway, that's my initial take on it, but we're going to get some different and, dare I say, much more intelligent perspectives on this topic from a number of speakers. You're in for a great session here, and at the end, after they speak individually, then we're going to have a group conversation. So as people are speaking, feel free to put comments or questions in the chat function. We're going to try to monitor those, and we'll feed those into the session that we have at the end. And I'll pop in between each speaker to introduce them. So let's move on to our first speaker. So our first speaker is from right here in Halifax. Like most cities, Halifax is still grappling with historic racism and dealing with the ongoing effects of the results of systemic racism. This is best personified in our community by the destruction of Africville a number of decades ago. And as the Black Lives Matter movement really kind of exploded and took off across the globe this past spring, one of the good things that came from it, it served to highlight some of the amazing community initiatives that have been happening, that are happening now, that have been happening for a while. And someone that's doing amazing work right here in Halifax is Rodney Small. And I'm not going to go through people's individual bios. Rodney's got the coolest one because his bio is actually on YouTube. It's a documentary called RDS Versus. We're going to put the link in the chat function. But without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Rodney.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everybody. And as we previously mentioned, we are here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We are situated on Mi'kma'ki, so unceded Mi'kma'ki territory. Definitely want to push that out in the air. Very important to do so. On that note, I'd like to welcome everybody as we start to discuss some of the work that we have been doing in the community for the last 6 years professionally. But I think it's really important to point out that I am born and raised in the north end of Halifax. And my story does actually come full circle. So I encourage you all to tap on the link and definitely take in the documentary, because it will give you a little bit of more insight of my upbringing, which is very, very important to this song and dance, I would like to call it. And on that note, we'll start by sharing the screen with, just give me a second. We'll do a share screen here. Share screen. And what we're going to be talking about today is a development that is happening in the north end of Halifax on a very, very popular site. In fact, the site itself is known as St. Pat's Alexandra. It is a popular school site, and I'm learning more and more about the site as I really indulge on the work that we're doing and trying to really bring the city, the developers, and the community all together to really work together towards one common goal, and that's really to create a community benefits agreement that would really create equitable initiatives in the program to offset the gentrification that we are currently seeing in the north end of Halifax. And I like to start by also, I have another PDF here I'm going to share with you all. See if we can get it to come up. I think it's on your screen now. I'd like to start by really sharing an executive summary that was put together. for the community benefit agreement to really advocate on behalf of creating something of that likes. Because one of the things that we've been hearing is, well, currently here in Halifax, it's not a thing. So I know we have people all around the world and these types of agreements are a thing, but here in Halifax, it's not a thing as of yet. So we have been doing a lot of work on the ground and trying to make it a thing. So one of the things I want to point out is we hear so much about Africville, and it's really important that we definitely point out what has happened at Africville. But I think what I want to point out here is at the very top, you will notice that since 2006 to 2016, the Black population of the North End dropped by half, as over 700 Black residents left the neighborhood where many had lived for generations. And the reason why I want to point this out is because many of us lived here based on the displacement that has taken place in not only Africville, but there was another community of Black people that were in the Cogswell area, and that's in the downtown core. If you're familiar with Halifax, Nova Scotia, Cogswell area is more in the area of the Scotia Square area in the downtown core. So there were many Black families, and not just Black families, lower income families, many of which happen to be Black, who were displaced originally from their homes there and pushed farther up into the north end of Halifax, where they ended up. From there, then became the world-renowned story of Africville. So with that being said, I think it was really important to point out that since 2006 to 2016, right here in Halifax, Nova Scotia's North End, displacement is alive and well. So gentrification is, as we say, our young kids would put it, the takeover is definitely in effect. And we've seen it. We've seen it in this time period that we're pointing out right here. In fact, like I said to you earlier on, I'm born and raised in the community. I haven't lived anywhere else. And the only place I've really been for a long period of time would be, quite frankly, and sad to say, was Waterville. And that's not by my choice. I can promise to tell you that. And I'll encourage you to go back to the documentary to learn more about that. But we're here to talk about the displacement and how we can really address the gentrification that is taking place in the north end of Halifax today. So I am also going to go back to the original renderings so that we can actually look at what we have been literally working with the developer to create. And right here is literally the rendering that has been put forth after 6 years of working closely with the community professionally to engage them in a meaningful way. One of the things we heard earlier on just moments ago with Andy, he was talking about engaging in a meaningful way. And we also heard Paul say some of the same things. So one of the things that we've learned how to do really well at the One North End Community Economic Development Society, and I will say we mobilized the One, AKA the One, during the last 2 years because community leaders, quite frankly, and advocates were isolated from these conversations that were taking place in the community. And it was important that we ensured that our youth knew and understood what was going on in our community, and more importantly, that they were attached to these conversations, because at the end of the day, as we all know, they are our future. They are our future. So what we decided, myself, along with some other lifelong residents, one who actually happens to be the counselor today. At the time, he was not the counselor. I think a lot of the work that we did really encouraged him to put his name forth to become the counselor, and lo and behold, he won that seat. So and that's Mr. Lindell Smith, along with another fine gentleman in the community by the name of Stephen Nelson, who was working out of the community YMCA at the time, and Lindell at the time was working at the library. These are two pillar organizations in our community. And when I say pillar organizations, these are organizations that many of the youth that look like me frequent on a regular basis as support systems, and they continue to be those places 20 years later, not to age myself out. But what we decided as a collective was to engage our community in a meaningful way. So we decided to start with the most vulnerable voices in our community. And we've been doing this work from the equitable lens, hence the reason why we needed to engage our community from the most vulnerable voice. And that just so happened to be African Nova Scotian youth. So what we did was we decided to hold our first engagement in our own space, and that was at the community Y. So many of us, the three of us who we would identify as, and I want to put this out there because when we talk about meaningful engagements and going into communities and engaging people's communities, we have to know who are the credible messengers. So what we realized is that we happen to be those credible messengers. At the time, I was coaching basketball. I was coaching for over 15 years and had some great relationships with the youth that I was coaching. Stephen Nelson was actually working at the Community Y. He was doing program development, so he had great relations with the youth. And then Lindell was doing program creation for youth at the library. So we all were at the time very credible messengers in our community who could hold these spaces in a very meaningful way. And when I say hold these spaces in a very meaningful way, there's an art. There's an art to how you actually host a conversation. In fact, there's a power in how you even invite somebody into your conversation. And your invite should reflect the space that you are going to hold. So what we started to realize is that we had a special way in engaging our community, and we wanted to really use this to create informed decisions and moving forth on really solutions regarding gentrification. We felt that, you know, our community was very welcoming and one of those places that people felt safe to come and really grow. So we wanted to you know, make sure that the people that are coming understood the history, the rich history that was attached to the north end of Halifax. Many of you all may not know, but we have a very, very famous, and I say famous, person who has been highlighted all around the world. And this person actually comes from the north end of Halifax. She ran her business out of the north end of Halifax. And that's the late, great Viola Desmond. Some of y'all may know her story. And if you don't, she's the Rosa Parks of Canada. In fact, her story happened before Rosa. No disrespects to my sister Rosa whatsoever, but Viola Desmond's story happened before Rosa Parks. And we are proud to say that Viola is from the north end of Halifax. And that $10 bill that highlights Viola also highlights our community. If you look close in the background, there's a map of the north end of Halifax. And on that notion, what we wanted to do was make sure that people understood the long history of African Nova Scotians that resided in this community, and the rich dialogue and vibrancy that we brought into the community to make it what it actually is today. And we thought it was really important to start these conversations with our youth. So what we decided to do after hosting our first conversation in our own space at the Community Y was we wanted to start taking these conversations into different areas. So we reached out to the schools. We decided that we wanted to take these conversations into the schools because one of the things we understood was we're not sure that our kids are learning about this rich history inside their textbooks. So on that notion, and I'm going to change the PDF here so that you can actually see some of the opportunity areas that were identified through our engagements. And then we'll double back to the design to show you how the developers actually worked closely with what we heard in our engagements, took that information back and incorporated it into the rendering. Now, the rendering is only a concept. I want to put that out there today. It's only a concept, and it's something that we have publicly put forth and are currently trying to get HRM on board, along with really community and the developers to really make this happen in a very, very sustainable way to ensure along with standing equitable, and I say that with emphasis, equitable impact. So on that note, we started with the engagements, like I said, with our young people, and you'll see there identified grassroots engagements with valuable youth at Oxford and Highland Park. These are the junior high schools in our community. And we went inside those schools because we wanted to empower our youth. We wanted to empower our youth so that they knew that they've been here for a long time. In fact, what we identified at that current time is that we had some youth that were connected to this community for up to 6 generations. And I say that very, very clearly, 6, not 4, not 5, literally 6 generations deep. And from those conversations with our youth, and we did these in silos. What we realized is that, and I don't know about you all, but I ain't saying some of the things that would be on my mind in front of mommy, especially when I was a little kid, because we just knew there was a space that you couldn't say some things. So one of the things we were very keen on was creating what we like to call a brave space. So we wanted to have these silo conversations because it helped us create a brave space. Now, we always hear about safe spaces, and I have nothing against a safe space. But what I like to point out is when we do create that safe space does allow that shy voice to fall back to the corner. That could be very valuable, by the way. Fall back to the corner and just let it be silent. But a brave space, on the other hand, it actually encourages that shy voice to actually be heard. So we really mastered the art of creating a brave space. And one of the things that we did was make sure that in creating these spaces, we knew who were going to be in those spaces so that we wouldn't make certain people feel uncomfortable to say what was in their heart or on their mind. So on that notion, what we did was we took the conversation from the schools back to the community into the parent resource centers. We can't talk to people's children and then not go back and talk to the parents and reflect on what we heard from the kids. Now, what was interesting was we wanted to hear from the parents how their upbringing was when they were kids, so that we could start to identify if there was any type of change in that amount of time. Well, neither here nor there. I won't tell you what the conclusion was, but I'm sure you all can get to that pretty clearly. So after speaking to the parents, we took the conversations out a little further, and we decided that we wanted to speak to homeowners. Many of the homeowners in the community were the new residents, but there were lots of homeowners in our community that lived there for generations. So we really wanted to start connecting some of the new homeowners with some of the ones that lived there for generations, because this was going to help us build those connections while ultimately telling a story based on experience. So people could speak to their experience on what the North End was like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So from there, we had our last conversations, and that was with our business community, business or nonprofit community. And then what happened was the conversation grew into what was known as the African Nova Scotian Youth Employment Lab. This was a conversation that ultimately, and when I say a conversation, these engagements, which ultimately grew to this African Nova Scotian Youth Unemployment Lab, this lab was literally created to answer the unemployment gap for African Nova Scotians between the ages of 18 and 35 compared to all other Nova Scotians between the ages of 18 and 35. It was literally funded through our poverty reduction strategy and was a way to really encourage dialogue and innovation around closing this gap. So lo and behold, we used these two opportunities, and as you see here, we had many opportunity areas from those conversations, which helped us get to the rendering that I will show you in moments, and take the next 2-3 minutes to discuss before turning it over for any questions, because I know our time is literally turning down. But what you will notice here on the first page is that some of the things that were incorporated, not some of the things, literally all the things that were incorporated based on what we would have heard from those engagements. And I will say those engagements that were done in a meaningful way, very genuine and sincere, grassroots level, credible messengers, very, very, what I will say is deep knowledge on the community. So a very, very deep essence on the art of hosting, which is really important. And what you'll notice here is that we got a lot incorporated into the rendering based on what we heard. And you'll notice that at the front here where you see me point, there's an entrepreneurship center. So what we heard in the community is that community needs an entrepreneurship center to encourage entrepreneurship. Well, we see it here. We look to have our own incubator. Down a little farther, you'll hear in our community, arts and music is a huge part of our culture. One of the things that we hear is we need a place to innovate and create. So similar to the startup space where we will innovate and create, we want to do this in an art space. Many of you may not be familiar with one of our most famous architects in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We have a very famous library, new built, not even 10 years old, almost looks similar to what we see here. We thought this would be a great way to encourage tourism to really come up into the community, along with the longevity and the historic story of the community, but also our connection to the late great Viola Desmond. Down here a little farther, you'll notice it says cafe. What's really important here is that not so the notion of a cafe itself, but retail space. So what I was saying earlier is that our community is being gentrified. One of the things that we do not see in the north end of Halifax, even though we have a very, very high African Nova Scotian population, is African Nova Scotian businesses, or even Black business per se. So we have very few Black businesses in our community. So the population, the business district does not currently represent the population that it serves, but we're hoping that one day we'll get back to that space. And there's lots of cool work that's happening to help us get there. Well, these are some of the things which ultimately will also support those cool initiatives. Last but not least, to kind of bring it full circle, and the rendering does go, in pretty details, but we pretty much it goes in great depths. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. We'll focus mainly on the first page for now, but just to bring it all full circle, one of the things that we heard throughout our engagements is, and a lot of people never heard of this terminology as of yet, but what we're talking about is creating a loving, safe, and beautiful community. And when we look at creating a loving, safe, and beautiful community, you should be able to bike, you should be able to walk, and you should be able to drive together. So this is one of the things that we wanted to present. What you'll see here is known as a woonarf, where you can actually do all these things in a safe manner. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to me today. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to throw them out into the comment section. I noticed the chat is popping here. I really wasn't focused on the chat. I was really delivering the presentation. So I appreciate a lot of the information that was being shared here. The one definitely is doing a lot of different initiatives. Really, the vision is the name. So as I said earlier, the full name is the One North End Community Economic Development Society. We were incubated through Common Good Solutions. So I myself am a Common Good Solutions employee who is currently on secondment, building out the nonprofit organization, which is known as The One. So on that note, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to throw them my way. I will say again, the vision is the name. So we believe in a community where if the tide is rising, then all the ships in the ocean will rise together and not just a select few. So that's a little bit about the work that we have been doing in the community. We appreciate each and every one of you and your attention to date, and wanted to thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Rodney. Great job. And yeah, keep the questions coming. If we don't have time to answer them, we can connect Rodney and we'll continue the conversation. This is really the start of that. So without further ado, we're going to move on to our second speaker this afternoon. Well, depending on where you are in the world, it's this afternoon here in Halifax. So going back to last February, admittedly, I had never heard of Jay Pitter. But by April, she was everywhere. She was online at virtual webinars, speaker forums. As we sat around the organizing team for the Artist City building, we said, we've got to get Jay Pitter for this conference. Who knows Jay? Which one of us knows Jay? And we formed a connection with Jay through the Canadian Urban Institute, who are helping us present this conference today. And so we landed her. We're so excited. I think probably it's because by her own admission, Jay loves Nova Scotia. And why wouldn't she? So we couldn't physically bring her here this time, but Jay, we still want you to come out and visit us when it's safe to do so. So please buckle your seatbelts and join me in welcoming from Toronto, Jay Pitter.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here, and it is an honor to always follow a local placemaker and a local expert. So thank you so much, Rodney, for your presentation. Slide, please. So, I had the opportunity to visit Africville approximately 2 decades ago as a part of the Governor General Leadership delegation. It was a wonderful opportunity for me as an emerging leader at that time. And I still recall standing at the Africville monument in the pouring rain and hearing that story for the first time in a really in-depth way, told by elders and community members with direct connections to the community. And later on, those folks hosted us, and it was really clear by the hospitality and the visceral pride of place. It really magnified what was lost. And it also magnified the indomitable spirit of the community. And, Rodney mentioned a safe and loving community. And that is exactly how I experienced folks from Halifax and also the direct descendants of individuals who lived in Africville. So building on Rodney's wise words, I'd like to just take a moment to zoom out a little bit wider to look at spatializing anti-Blackness across Canada. Slide, please. So, one of the things that I think about when I think about anti-Blackness and overall urban inequity across the country, I first think about my cultural community, and I often say that we are stolen people living on stolen lands. And so that creates a very particular complication. And for Black people ensnared by the transatlantic slave trade, the auction block was actually our first encounter with public space. I want you to think about that for a moment. So the auction block was our first encounter with public space, where we were sort of introduced in a critical mass. And of course, we are not a singular community, and we have many different histories and pathways to Canada. And we also know that some Black folks are also part Indigenous, so they're very long-standing roots here as well. But that particular moment in history really has shaped the ways in which Black people are seen and received in public. And, the auction block induced a terror far greater than the cowardly crack of the whip, as it marked separation from loved ones and the beginning of a long walk into an unknown suffering. And so much of this suffering for Black people in this country has indeed been place-based, tethered to land use. But again, I mentioned that I wanted to even fan out a little bit wider and to acknowledge that numerous equity-seeking groups have been historically harmed by urban planning and other land use professions. And it goes all the way back, and I've talked about this before, so I'm going to move through these points quite quickly. It goes all the way back to colonization. So what we know is that surveying land and defining uses and defining classes of people who get access to particular types of land close to good resources and connectivity and pathways, that started centuries ago and is embedded in surveying and the colonial project itself. Moving forward, we have to think about the ways in which car-centric infrastructure has been weaponized against not only Black people. So we know that the Africville story is a story that is linked to car-centric infrastructure being weaponized against the Black community, but we know that it's also weaponized against low-income communities and people who are unable to sort of show up for themselves in powerful ways in public consultation processes, because there aren't those meaningful pathways or those proper messengers that Rodney spoke about. Today, we live with a legacy of especially high fatalities in low-income racialized communities right across Canada. We also know that there's a social aspect of street safety, which we never talk about. Things like gender-based harassment, unhoused people being targeted, individuals with mental health issues experiencing a crisis in public transit harassment. And we know that citizen and police profiling are prevalent right across the country, specifically in Halifax, Montreal, and Toronto. Research and reports have shown that Black communities and other racialized communities are highly targeted. Another thing that we don't talk about a lot when we are talking about our experiences in the public realm is the way that a lot of invisible policies and laws shape our experiences. One of the most powerful and potent policies and laws is the anti-vagrancy law, which gives police power, inappropriate power, to stop people on suspicion. This law actually came from Britain, and it was originally used to keep people, wait for it, in their place. That is what the law was used for, to maintain the British social hierarchy. Applied throughout the Americas, what we see is that people who are seen as being poor, disabled, unhoused, performing in public, sleeping in public, such a wide array of individuals and behaviors have been on the receiving end of the vagrancy law being misapplied to over-police people in the public realm. We also know that we have a number of racist housing ordinances. And so while in Canada we don't talk about redlining, it's very important to know that racist ordinance which disallowed people of color and Jewish people from living in particular neighborhoods right across Canadian cities have actually resulted in a contemporary modern day class and racial segregation. The list is extensive, but I share these ideas with you just to lay some good ground for some of our conversation this afternoon, especially as we are speaking in a national context. One of the things that often comes up when we talk about these types of histories within urbanism and placemaking, there's a tendency to want to empower people. I understand the sentiment of this, but I strongly disagree with this approach. Slide, please. So it is so critical that we stop empowering people, because empowering someone suggests that you are omnipotent, and it also centers you in a particular kind of way. It takes away from the reality that every single human being and every single historically marginalized group or not possess a sort of power. Everyone is inherently powerful. So we don't want to empower people as placemakers and urbanists. What we want to do is create the space to share resources, information, and our design insights and capacity so that people can activate their own power and co-create a vision for their communities. Slide, please. So, during this pandemic, I have been a part of a number of talks. Paul mentioned that he didn't know who I was until lately. I've been doing this work solidly for 20 years. My background is rooted in urban design and social justice. And so long before the pandemic, I've been leading this conversation actually across North America. And one of the things that I have found in doing this work is that there are sometimes moments which call for ethical rule breaking. So if we are to really respond to communities, sometimes we have to break the rules, because the truth is that bylaws and laws really sometimes contravene good placemaking and impinge on people's human rights and their rights to beauty, dignified housing, amenities, safe streets. And so during the pandemic, I was asked to lead a design intervention looking at the air quality and heat in low-income communities, the kind of communities that I grew up in. Slide, please. And so, I started this project, and what I realized when I entered these communities, which have inherited terrible design, lack of amenities, lack of space, lack of green space, is that, people in individual units were suffering so much, and we simply didn't have the time or the resources to address the depth and the breadth of the issues. And so what I very quickly did was recalibrate and hone in on community spaces and community hubs. So again, to Rodney's point, in our communities, community hubs and social service places, spaces are so incredibly important. And so one of the spaces that we focused on is this daycare. I'd like you to just take a look at some of these images. So if you look at the image to your top far left with all those mounds of toys, that is actually a closet-sized room where racialized female daycare workers were expected to take their break, It doubles as a storage room, so it has more toys than ever because of the fact that COVID guidelines for daycare have changed, and so people have had to store many of the toys. So daycares have had to store much of their toys to be compliant with the safety rules. And this room also doubled as a janitorial room. Now, I just want you to think about that for a moment. The racialized women who take care of our children, right? I want you to look at that pile of toys in that room. They are expected to take a break in a room with mops and buckets and free toys that could fall on top of them. There was only an old couch blocking a very small vent in that room. Very quickly, as we begun to do the audit, I worked with a couple of architects who were amazing on the project as well. They started doing a spatial audit, and I worked with one of the architects talking to the daycare workers themselves. Within placemaking and urbanism, we call them users. I never do. They are always my number one client, and they are always collaborators. That's how I consider people who use the spaces, not users or user groups. And so we started asking questions, and one of the things that I was struck by was that when I started asking questions about air quality and the heat, what we learned was that the children in the daycare, who are all under 4 years old, were sleeping longer, or when they were awake, they were lethargic and also engaged in more conflict due to the poor air quality and the heat in this daycare. That was a direct, those kinds of outcomes are directly aligned with the research showing the adverse health impacts of heat and air quality issues in sick buildings. As a mother, as a placemaker, I was so incredibly alarmed hearing this sort of thing. And so, I had a real decision to make because the funding, part 2 of the funding that was promised to me wasn't coming. It was slow. And so I spent about 10 days staying up at night, figuring out what my next move needed to be. As I was talking to the workers, they were telling me that I would have to, go through the building, management, the same building management who, by the way, kicked them out of their office space, moving them into this storage closet with janitorial equipment. On around day 8, I literally could not sleep anymore. I was very clear about the fact that the challenges that have been raised and have been long-standing but laid bare by the pandemic, that I couldn't really, address everything, but I knew that I could address something, and so I decided to break the rules. Slide, please. And so instead of waiting on funding or waiting for funders to get back to me or talking to people, the building management, waiting for them to answer the many emails I sent that went unanswered, I decided that as a practice, we would move forward and address the space so that children and the workers could have a dignified space. And so this is some of the work that we did. So if you look at the top left-hand side, this property is located close to a woodland area. It was very important for me to bring the beauty of the outside and the green space into the daycare space. I thought that would be very stimulating for the children. And one of the things that I noted is that when I go to daycares in middle-class neighborhoods, they look different than the daycare that I was standing in. So I wanted this daycare to be as bright, as beautiful, as stimulating for those children, because every child in this country deserves a fair start in life. And so we, the photo in your bottom right, that is the room that had the stack of toys. We basically built cabinets, gave them a new couch, opened up the vents. One of the other things that we did that was so seemingly small but made a tremendous difference was swapping out their AC units. So one of the architects on the team, Paul Kulig, very quickly noted that the units they were using in this daycare were intended for a small living room with 4 bodies. So imagine that, a daycare with many bodies and many children using a unit that was intended for a home living room with only 4 bodies. Slide, please. And so this for me was the most precious moment of that project. You know, this is Rasha, and she is the manager in this daycare. And she doesn't quite have an office. You come through the entrance, and this is her like little nook area. And during the day, the outside door has to be closed and the door to the daycare has to be closed. There is 0 ventilation in this room and no windows. It was very important to me to spend time making Rasha's office a dignified space. And when she came to the daycare the night we were finishing off with her family and just looking at her daughter and how proud her daughter was to see her mom receive a dignified workspace. You know, when we think about placemaking and placemakers, we often forget those placemakers on the front lines doing essential, dangerous work, you know, occupying spaces that are not safe, not dignified, and not beautiful. It was just so important to me to be able to, you know, extend this space for her. And this work would not have been possible without the 11 women who at the last moment showed up and lent extra hands to making sure that this space would be prepared and ready for the children within just 3 days. Slide, please. So I'll just very quickly share with you the lessons that I've learned recently and the lessons that guide my practice. Don't ask for permission, do the right thing now. One of the reasons I think that some folks haven't heard of me is because I haven't made it in mainstream urbanism. I'm a rule breaker. I think that if we want to build communities that are equitable, you have to break the rules. You have to be prepared to work from the margins, work twice as hard, and maybe get praised later on in your career. Maybe not at the front end because everyone won't follow you right away, and that's totally okay. Also, forget about your title or formal processes. Get your hands dirty. When we were cleaning that daycare, I am telling you that I mopped myself and one of my friends mopped mouse species off that floor more than 6 different times because of how neglected the building is. When I say get your hands dirty, I really mean it. Get your hands dirty. Also, communities always move faster than bureaucracies. My friends showed up within 48 hours. I ended up receiving funding to cover the work that we did recently, and I'm very grateful for that funding. But if I didn't go out ahead, if my friends and those women didn't join me, this work would not have been completed right now. Also, when communities are centered, small design interventions can make a huge difference. And my final lesson, placemaking is personal. What I didn't tell you is that this daycare is located on the ground floor of the public housing building where I grew up. My work is personal. I am unapologetic about that. Whether I am working in a building where I grew up or working in a low-income community in one of the 20 cities where I have the privilege of working across North America, I always take on the work as though those women are my mothers and my aunties. I take it on as though those children are my own children. I'm a mother. When I go into low-income communities, I think of myself and my friends. I think about the ways that I almost didn't make it. I think about kids who deserve a fighting chance, kids who haven't made it, who aren't making it, because we're not doing what we need to do as placemakers and urbanists. Thanks for listening.
Great, thank you, Jay. At the end of all these conferences, we put together a little promotional, not a promotional video, but kind of a recap video. We're always looking for those little sound bites to intrigue people. So stop empowering people. I almost guarantee is going to be on there somewhere. So we're going to come back to Jay and Rodney later on, but we're going to move on now to our next speaker. So it was about a year ago that I went to my last in-person conference, which was the International Downtown Association Conference, which last year was in Baltimore. And they introduced a young man named Albus Brooks from Denver. Go Nuggets. Anyway, he was a football player. He was a city councilor. He was a developer. He was an activist for inclusion and diversity. I believe he was a preacher. So now he's going to take us to church. So please welcome from Denver, Mr. Albus Brooks.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jay and Rodney, for your incredible words. And I promise you, everyone, Rodney and Jay and I did not talk before this. It was really interesting to see how globally, as we look around cities and reimagining cities, that we're starting to use the same language around this. This is really exciting. So I'm going to share my screen real quick, and we'll get going. I want to make sure that everybody can see this because my screen just went away. Can you guys see this? Just give me a... I'm going to assume you can. Okay, so like was said, my name is Albus Brooks. I am now the vice president of Millender White. It is a development and construction company running in Colorado and Southern California. And my perspective is going to come from the seat of the developer, to come from the seat of, I was the president of Denver City Council, and coming from a seat of a community organizer, which I still call myself. So I'm all of the three, but I think it's important for us to see transformation, that we have folks in private development who get it and who understand kind of what we're going through. Right here, you'll see I'm titling this Rebuilding the American City. This is the context, is where I come from, but this can be easily transmittable. The context changes, but the principles do not. Our cities, and what you'll see in my belief was built on a white supremacist, racist foundation. And to build an inclusive city, we need to rebuild all of our cities. Of course, I used to say that statement before the pandemic, before all of the rioting and police brutality that has the George Floyd incident, and folks would look at me crazy. But now I think people understand that our cities are broken, and they're broken because they're built on a racist context. I ask a lot of the folks who are looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that has gone on, and not judge it, but seek to understand before being understood. Martin Luther King said, riot is the language of the unheard and the oppressed. And I think loud and clear, we are hearing what the community is saying. But why? Why do they feel like they are oppressed? Why do we feel like we are unheard? And I'm just going to give you one policy. I could talk about 400 years in our global history of slavery and all of these issues. But I want to talk about one policy that impacted our city and caused a cataclysmic effect globally, that I think we're seeing now. Now, one of the things in World War II that we look at and praise our veterans in America who went over to fight in World War II, we saw that the Congress at the time passed the GI Bill, and it was something that everyone supported. It was something that everyone believed in. However, what we see is that support and that belief and those benefits did not go to African-American soldiers. 1.2 million African-American soldiers. My grandfather fought in World War II. As a matter of fact, Black soldiers couldn't fight at first. They were told to build latrine for white soldiers. And so he was a part of that. But he was a part of the platoons that began to fight for the first time. And he deserved those benefits. He deserved to come back home and be able to find new housing, new opportunities in communities. But he didn't. He did not have those opportunities that white soldiers did. And what we see in that moment when soldiers came back and the baby boom started and the subsidized suburbanization started in America because of these benefits. Black soldiers were relegated to urban ghettos, red line communities, and rural places. And as you see here on my chart that I put together, we see in America the gap. There was already a gap from slavery and the racism and the Jim Crow South and all of these issues. But here begins the wealth gap that began to tear our cities apart. The GI Bill, the white flight, the subsidized sprawl in white America, the political representation, intergenerational wealth, sentences leniency, access to higher education comes out to compounding interest in gain. And in the Black community, we see the redlining, the eminent domain, the condemnation laws, the urban renewal, the race riots, Jim Crow laws, voter disenfranchisement, mass incarceration, health disparities, and the exclusion of what I talked about, the GI Bill, the wedge gap, compounding loss and pain. These are the issues that we begin seeing in our community. And it started with this GI Bill. Now, everybody on this call and people who want to be a part of cities and city building and have a vision, they go with the best intentions. But as Jay talked about, even our best intentions seek to empower and have racist roots. So what does it really mean to be an ally and be an accomplice and be a city rebuilder? And I point out to you that we all must always take sides of neutrality. That helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormented, never the tormented. I think it's important that we and folks who are allies and accomplices take a side and pick a side and figure out what it takes. And that's what you're hearing today at this conference, and you're hearing from these folks. And in the past, I will make the statement that I feel like folks who've been neutral and silent do more damage than white nationalists. Because the silent individuals are the majority, and they are allowing systemic racism to build and build in their own city, and they're a part of it in ways that they don't even know. So I don't want to just talk about these opportunities without giving you education material to study for yourself and figure out what this means in your own context. One of my favorite books, and I think if you are in anything around city building and real estate and things like that, you need to read this book, Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And it talks about how we build segregation throughout our cities, federally, through federal laws, Federal Housing Act dollars, all of these, it was intentional. And it talks about the detail of it. I read this book like 2 or 3 times now, and I'm picking it up again because I think it's so important to really dismantle, and I think Jay talked about this, to really dismantle what has been created. We have to intentionally break up the system, because the system is actually used, and this is a person who's been a part of the system for 10 years as the president of Denver City Council, worked nationally on housing policy, worked in my state on it. The system is used to really oppress the least of these. We've got to break that up to really do something different. So to really begin to heal, we've got to educate ourselves and learn. I want to touch on this because I think it is critical. We are living in segregated cities. If you don't think that the laws 50 years ago are not today, I think you're wrong. I think you do not understand what is going on. So Jay talked about anti-Black racial entropy. That is still carried on all over this globe today. But how that happens in a city is very interesting. Is Blacks and others are relegated to one section of the city. We call that redlining in the United States. Spatial mismatch theory is making sure that the resources needed to survive and thrive in a community are not placed within your distance, within your reach. And so in that theory, these resources and opportunities are placed around and not near. And so you can look at sections of the city. You can look at this in the city of Denver. We call it the inverted L. And in the inverted L have our highest obesity rates, our graduation rates. This is where the most people of color live. And this has been a strategy from the very beginning. And those are things we have to break down. And obviously the culture of poverty theory, which now that you've set up this anti-Black entropy, you've put this social mismatch theory, now you are believing, you are getting the community to believe this is how poverty is. Why are these people like that? Why can't they just get a job? Why can't they just come together? But you have designed it from the beginning. It's a crime. So as was mentioned before, Paul talked about me being a minister. I am a recovering minister of the gospel, and I think one important word to me is shalom. It's a Hebrew word, and a lot of people see it as peace, but it's more than that. It's about restoration and repair, and that's what I believe we have to be as city rebuilders. Before we do anything, we have to see our work as a holy work. We have to see our work as divine, that we are repairing a community that has been destroyed and has been turned over and has been racialized, and it was never intended to be like that in the first place. So what does it mean to repair, to restore? And that's the posture we need to take. Now, what's the action that we need to do? In my city of Denver, one of the things that I proposed, and we rewrote the entire city plan, development plan, and we started with an equity lens. And we one of the things we put together in our city is to start looking for our city planners, no longer focusing on RNOs, and our RNOs are registered neighborhood organizations, and they usually go out to them, get the information out, and that's how it is. No, you are going to start making sure you're going to the churches. You are going to start making sure you're going to the rec leagues. You are going to start making sure you talk to gang members in the community. You will talk to everyone in the community to get an understanding of that community. And we've done that. What we've done in our neighborhood and city plans is just focus on those with wealth and means and the ability to speak, not the folks who are on the margins, who we set up to be on the margins. And so that's the new plan that we had. We had a redesign, not just focusing on folks who are at the city, who are planners, but taking young people. How do you imagine, and what would you love to see in your community? And so we put them to the table. And then rebuilding, and this is the part where I'm in, the construction and development industry. What does economic empowerment look like? When most folks think about economic empowerment, they think about entry-level jobs. When I think about it, I think about Black and brown wealth. How do we wealth? So much wealth has been taken from this community just because of our laws. How do we build wealth in a community? So I know that this is Nova Scotia and a lot of Canadian folks, and I even saw some folks from London. What's up? I hope you know who this is. This is Nipsey Hussle. He was actually assassinated in Los Angeles. He's a rapper, and I think you heard Rodney talk about gentrification. Nipsey was one of the first leaders to really say, you know what? We've used this word as such a horrible word. Because whites have come into our community and pushed us out. What if we begin to gentrify our own community? And in this picture right here, you see Nipsey cutting the ribbon on a building that he bought. And why it's so significant is that Nipsey Hussle 20 years earlier was selling drugs in this building. And he got a vision for his life on the streets at this building and said, I want to reclaim my community. He didn't go move somewhere else. He said, my own community, I'm about to buy back the block. And this is significant. This is, how do we look at individuals in our community and start to begin to think of, okay, how do I not empower, right? But how do I share power with the individuals in my community on ownership, on incubator space, things like that. We'll talk about that in just a second here. So something that, we champion here in the city, and it's done in a couple other cities. I'm starting to see a lot of excitement around it, but it's building affordable housing for displaced neighbors first. What we saw was we built a ton of affordable housing in the city of Denver, and new millennials were moving into it instead of single moms and folks from the community who have been displaced. And so we worked with HUD, worked with some other organizations as well to start identifying folks who had been displaced in this neighborhood. This particular development just has been approved. It's called the Clara Brown Commons. Clara Brown was an African slave who got out of slavery, built a business up, and became a millionaire in the city in Colorado. And this, and she gave away all of her money as well. And this development is a picture of her life, which is giving back to the community and making sure it's 100% affordable, 30% to 80% AMI. And it is the issue with this land is that it was a slumlord owned it. And we as a city took it from the slumlord, renamed it as Clara Brown Commons, and now the community will have a place to go. One of the things that we're working on in the city of Denver right now too is creating an entrepreneurial center for people of color, specifically for people of color. Because of what was done, justice is delivering, right, repairing, restoring what was taken, right? And we believe that creating an entrepreneur center of color, specifically for folks, technical support, capital support from private sector banks and from the city, grants from our foundation community to start to focus on the community of color and how to build their businesses up in some incubator space as well. I just want to touch on this as I'm winding down here. The 5 points when I came into office in 2010 was the top 10 gentrified communities in the United States. When I came in, there were several Black folks who were upset. In the last 10 years, folks moved out 5 points, and we said, what could we do? And so this is when I just started my Black Wealth Initiative campaign. And all of the individuals from this community, we wanted to make sure that they had a hand in rebuilding this community. And so to the gentleman up there in the maroon jacket, many of you may not know him, but he is very famous. It's Robert Smith. He's the wealthiest individual Black person in the United States. Robert Smith was speaking at Morehouse University when he talked about repaying all of their loans when he was speaking there. That's probably how you know him. Well, he is a Denver native. And I approached him several years ago about making an investment into Black businesses, Black entrepreneurship, Black architects, Black developers to reclaim the renaissance of 5 points. And just to let you know, 5 points in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was a red line community in Denver where the most famous, it was called the Harlem of the West. It was the most famous jazz player, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Lena Horne, all of these incredible jazz artists. And after the crack epidemic in the 80s and 90s, it was largely vacant and then began to be gentrified. But today it is over 50% Black owned, and we're excited about the opportunities that is happening there. Let me leave you with this quote. As we think about the city of the future and the future of cities, it isn't one with flying cars and towers that reach to the heavens. It's about the regenerative ecosystems, the inclusive economies, the just societies where equity and social mobility go hand in hand. Do not talk anymore to me about how economically viable your city is. Show me that there is social mobility for every disenfranchised piece of your community. And then you'll show me an economically prosperous city. Thank you.
Thank you. I pause there so everyone can say amen. Thank you, Albus. Great talk, and thank you for leading us through that journey and for leaving us with a lot of hope at the end. So we're moving right along to our next speaker, who's Uytae Lee. I'm very happy to introduce Uytae, a proud Dalhousie graduate like myself. Those of us that are involved in plan issues here in Halifax will know Uytae primarily for the videos that he first did with Planifax, which really was these creating these short, informative, extremely accessible videos, bringing planning issues to the general public in a way that they could understand and engage with. Unfortunately, we've lost Uytae to the West Coast, where he's continuing to do great things. He's really nailed a unique style. I know people will want to check out some of his videos. Well, maybe we'll post some links in the chat function as well. His most recent one on the future of transit was both terrifying and comforting, somehow at the same time. So coming to us today from Vancouver, Mr. Uytae Lee.
Hello, hello. Hey, Paul. Yes, I am on the West Coast right now, but man, I miss Halifax so dearly sometimes. Shout out to Dalhousie School of Planning, class of 2015, 2016. Shout out to Freemansville, New York with the garlic fingers, and shout out to Planifax, of course, kind of that thing that started it all. It is a huge honor for me to be a part of this conference, to follow like great speakers such as Rodney, such as Jay and Albus. It's a conference I've been to, gosh, I think every year since it started, the last 4 years. I was the videographer behind the scenes back then, but now it's like I'm presenting. So, I'm incredibly nervous about it, but we're gonna go for it. So let me quickly share my slides here. Let's see if I can figure this out. Boom, okay. So like Paul was saying, I make videos about urban planning issues, and that's sort of the role I do. But today I kind of want to actually just share a story. It's one I just finished writing. I'm hoping to make a video about it. And when TJ and Kurash invited me to the conference and mentioned the topic of inclusion, I just felt like this story kind of had something to offer to our conversation today, and maybe something more than I could just contribute by myself. So it's a story about Vancouver's missing middle. So let me give you some backdrop. This is a photo of Vancouver. Maybe it's a photo you recognize. This is what goes on the marketing, goes on the postcards at urban planning conferences worldwide, I'm sure. But this picture is really just half the story, or to be accurate, it's like 20% of the story. If you zoom out, what do you see? What do you get? Lots and lots of houses, single family residential neighborhoods. In fact, 81% of Vancouver's residential land is comprised of single family homes or duplexes. This is the stuff that is some of the most expensive real estate in Canada. And you see sort of this pattern, oh, wait, just a second, I'm messing up my slides. We also have like agricultural reserve land, which is mostly used for golf courses, but that's a story for another time, because the point I'm trying to make is across Metro Vancouver, you see this pattern of development. You have houses and you have apartments, and very, very little in between. To me, this pattern kind of repeats itself a lot through Metro Vancouver. The most sort of poignant example for me is this neighborhood in Burnaby, just the next city over, called Brentwood Town Center. That's Brentwood Town Center. It is comprised of several high-rises, including the second and fourth tallest buildings in British Columbia. And right next to it, we have single-family houses. So this phenomenon, oh, wait, again, messing up my slides. Okay, this is what it looks like on the ground, which is pretty crazy. Like I said, right? You got like supersize or Happy Meal, go big or go home, literally. And so again, like I was saying, this phenomenon, this is called the missing middle. And so what's missing? Well, other types of housing, like townhouses, your walk-up apartments, duplexes, the dingbat, which is one of my favorite examples. And these neighborhoods, these buildings sort of form some of the most desirable neighborhoods across North America. You think of the townhouses, the Painted Ladies in San Francisco, walk-up apartments in New York and Brooklyn, as well as Halifax's very own sort of heritage buildings. A lot of those heritage buildings are missing middle buildings. They offer a lot of promise to people concerned about the housing affordability crisis because they can fit quite a bit more density into neighborhoods without necessarily changing the scale of them too much. But in Vancouver, we really just don't build a whole lot of them. In 2018, Vancouver built 1,400 detached houses, 4,400 apartment units, and 56 row houses. So that was where I wanted to, really investigate for this story. Why is the missing middle missing? Now, we're at an urban planning conference, so I'm sure the answer is not surprising to any of you. The missing middle is missing because it's illegal. Yes, setback and height restrictions really limit the size of building you can build on your property. Parking minimums often force buildings like townhouses to build expensive concrete parkades underneath them, which really just makes the development financially not make sense. And of course, we have the zoning bylaw. This is the zoning map for Vancouver with its various different colors, showing what you can build where. But this is another way to interpret it. The properties in yellow are the properties where you can only build a single family house or a duplex. It's recently been updated to allow secondary units and laneway houses. But that's beside the point, because everything else, the stuff in blue, that's where you can build everything else, essentially. So to me, this is where the story really began to get interesting. What are the conditions that created the need for these kind of rules? Why did we create these rules in the first place? And my approach for that was to go back in time to when this bylaw, to when these rules were written. And that year was 1927. Boom. It was written by this guy called Harlan Bartholomew. And I'm sure in Halifax, maybe you guys know of a planner named Thomas Adams. He was like a world famous urban planner that did a lot of consulting for North American cities. Harlan Bartholomew, I like to describe as sort of like the knockoff version of that. He did a lot of sort of master plans across North America, some of them actually ending up really segregating a lot of cities. Anyway, sorry, this is like my attempt at a meme as well. So I'll just quickly move on. So Harlan Bartholomew was hired by the city of Vancouver in 1927 to write an overall plan and vision for the city and come up with a zoning bylaw. And when you look at some of the text in the original plan, you can see that his key direction given to him by council at the time was to prevent the intrusion of apartment houses in single or two family residential neighborhoods. So that's interesting. What did we have against the apartment houses back then? Why did we want to prevent the intrusion of them? Well, to give you some context, downtown areas were going through a bit of a rough time at the turn of the 19th century. They were often associated with problems. Industrial cities like New York and London had tenement buildings where diseases like cholera were pretty frequently a concern. You also had several really controversial, huge, massive fires that took place in various cities across North America. Vancouver actually had a huge one that pretty much razed the whole city just a few months after it was incorporated. So these downtown apartments were associated with a lot of issues and problems that a lot of people were worried about during that time. And so for those who could afford it, the single family neighborhood, that single family house on the outskirts of the city was really the refuge, the escape. And, it offered things that people really prioritized at the time, things like air circulation and sun exposure. If you look at the text, people really thought these two things were critical for fighting diseases like typhoid and cholera for some reason. But of course, like having, houses spaced wide apart, kind of helped, mitigate fire risks as well, right? Now, also happening at the same time were transportation innovations like the streetcar and the automobile, which really helped make it feasible for a lot of people to, just live outside the city and commute in for work just during the day and then go back to their homes in the suburbs kind of escape from the city in the evening. Now, those are like some pretty understandable concerns for me, but there were also some more really suspect attitudes at the time, things that I really don't think deserve our sympathy today. You see, like attitudes towards downtown areas, were also incredibly, how can I say, like classist and like definitely racist. So this is a political cartoon from 1907 from Vancouver Saturday Sunset, and it's a cartoon that pretty much sums it all up for me. Let's zoom in. So at the front, the top panel, it says, "The typical home of Vancouver's white working man." The panel right beneath it, "A warren on Carroll Street infested by 2,000 Chinese." And just like in the bottom left corner, you got a Chinese dude smoking an opium pipe. So great. Yeah, so like I said, really like a mixture of, some understandable public health concerns, but also some really quite messed up ideas about, moral superiority and racial superiority kind of informed this zoning bylaw. And I think architectural historian Anthony Sutcliffe really explains this well. Oh, and wait, sorry. This is also when height restrictions and parking regulations also came into effect. Anyways, here's the Anthony Sutcliffe quote: "Zoning originated not only to promote safer, healthier cities, but also to keep the poor in their place." Okay, so now I'm gonna push us a little bit more forwards throughout time, which, saw other innovations come through, like running water. Amazing. Fire extinguishers, smoke detectors, right? Upgraded, building codes and whatnot. So, throughout time, or as time went on, we really began to resolve many issues with apartments, some of the, sort of practical concerns we had. So we're definitely not concerned about cholera or fires anymore. But at the same time, the zoning bylaws haven't really changed much, right? This zoning map of Vancouver is essentially the same zoning map from 1927. The single family residential areas you see on the map in white, they haven't changed in 93 years. So that's part one of it. But also our fear and sort of hostility to densification has also remained. Building any kind of density in sort of these single family zones in Vancouver is an incredibly controversial move. And again, it's a very messy mix of concerns. And I've compiled just like sort of a collage of some of the more common concerns that frequently come up. Privacy of people's backyards is a big concern that comes up. Neighborhood character, of course. Heritage, I know, is something that comes up a lot in Halifax. There's noise concerns. Parking, everyone worries about having enough parking available. And densification is a threat to that in some ways. A very kind of unique to Vancouver one, I might say, is sunlight, because a lot of Vancouver single family houses also have they do like some urban gardening in the backyard. And so, those basil plants, they love sun. Having anything to kind of cover that up with shadows, God forbid. And then of course, traffic and congestion. But again, like the past, I think some of the rhetoric is also incredibly suspect. It's not so innocent. And I'll give you kind of like a timeline of some of this commentary throughout Vancouver's history. In 1956, as the city was banning secondary suites across the board in Vancouver single family housing zones, the key reasoning given behind it was a fear that those secondary suites would turn these houses into boarding houses, which could turn those areas into slums. In the 1980s, Vancouver experienced a wave of immigration from Hong Kong. Those people were fleeing their homeland as it was being returned to China. So as these immigrants came to Vancouver and other parts of Canada, they brought their extended families. And because of that, they ended up building bigger houses in building bigger houses so you could have, an extra room for your grandma or your uncle or aunt. The pushback from single family neighborhood residents at this time just became really, really ugly. So, this is just a quote that I took from one of the council meetings back then. And I think it just says it all for me, right? We fear the power that Hong Kong money wields. These people come with no concern for our past. They have no right to devastate the residential areas. So in 1988, in response to these sort of concerns, the city sort of clamped down and increased the setback and height restrictions to prevent any more of these, so-called monster houses. My girlfriend tells me I pronounce monster wrong, like with a G. Anyways, monster houses from being built. All right, next slide. Okay, so in the 2000s, Vancouver took a bit more of a progressive step forward. They legalized secondary suites again, as well as laneway houses. And again, we saw like an incredibly vitriolic outrage from the community, and one that really shows how the single family neighborhood has become ingrained as one of our a key value in our own culture. Okay, and then finally, one sort of more recent example, this 5-story apartment proposal in Kitsilano being described as the ghetto. Okay, so what I'm trying to sort of paint a picture here is really, how difficult it has been to add any new density into Vancouver's single family neighborhoods as a result of this sort of, this cultural history we have, this baggage we have around densification. And so to me, that's the first half of the missing middle story. The second half is what happens instead. When it's so difficult to add any new housing into established residential areas, which were added there because of exclusion, what you end up having is huge, really dense developments in select and less controversial areas. Areas like Vancouver's Expo lands. Here it is right there on the map or the photo. In 1988, the Expo lands was an undeveloped post-industrial site at the southern edge of Vancouver's downtown peninsula, had a population of 0. Here it is today. That site now has almost 10,000 housing units. And this is sort of a similar story that sort of happens across our region. That's what you're seeing with Brentwood Town Center, right? Huge developments that are put up because that's really the only places where those new developments and that new housing can go. I think this Gordon Price, who's a former councillor for the city of Vancouver, describes it well. He came up with this term for it called the grand bargain. And sort of how I understand it is that, let me see here, like huge density development in certain areas is politically tolerated as long as these established single family neighborhoods are kept the same. All right, so that kind of like takes us to the present, because this sort of grand bargain has worked pretty well for a city like Vancouver, actually. It's really given it a lot of recognition on the international stage for urban planning geeks such as myself. But today, this sort of model of development has really resulted in some problems. The first issue being that we've built out most of these sort of post-industrial sites. Vancouver has very few sites, places remaining that are like the Expo lands. So now that new development is going into lower income areas like Chinatown or purpose-built rental building neighborhoods in Burnaby. In these areas, these new developments, they're so massive and big, right? They actually are huge changes into the existing community, much more than something like a missing middle sort of development would do. And ultimately, they don't just change the character of the community; they straight up evict people, right? And ultimately, in Vancouver, I feel like we've created a socially and physically divided city. The single family house on the left, that housing takes up 81% of the residential land in Vancouver, but that kind of housing is affordable to just 2.5% of Vancouverites. So everyone else increasingly, most of us anyways, increasingly live in areas and corridors and city hubs and downtown areas in the fringes of our community where change is almost a constant threat and where change is massive. That's kind of the story of Vancouver's missing middle I wanted to say today, but now I'm going to wrap it up. Really, the topic of this session was how we could have a more inclusive process for building our cities. And I think in order to do that, it's important to understand what exclusion looks like both physically and culturally in our own cities. And what I've learned from Vancouver's example is that this exclusion it's really messy. Sometimes it's obvious. It's like people being afraid of Chinese opium dens in apartments. But other times it can seem like the pragmatic thing to do, right? Things like preserving character or setting a minimum number of parking spaces for new developments. But all that messy, complex reasoning for our hostility towards densification ultimately yields the same results. The results ultimately look the same. So as we talk more about inclusive cities today, I hope my little story kind of helped remind us of some of the exclusionary history and regulations that we're building on, similar to like how Mr. Brooks, Albus Brooks, sort of painted in his last presentation. So that is everything from me. I'll stop sharing my screen if I can. Oh, there it is. Yeah, and thanks so much for listening to me, guys. Yeah, really appreciate it.
All right, well, thank you, Uytae. I think we can all agree that was a monstrously good talk. And if they don't appreciate you in BC, please come back to Halifax. So the final speaker in this session is Kimberly Driggins. Kimberly has had a pretty varied biography, which you can check out. It's now brought her to the Washington Housing Conservancy in the sleepy little town of Washington, D.C. In the last session, you got to meet the mayor of our city, and we are currently, as he mentioned, in the midst of leading up to a municipal election. Last week, we had a mayoralty forum with our 3 mayoral candidates. And really, for the first time that I can recall, all 3 of the candidates identified housing affordability as the top issue that they want to tackle. And that simply hasn't been the case. It hasn't been on the radar of our candidates in years past. So that's a seismic shift. But like most cities, it's a huge challenge here in Halifax, and we need to share ideas from other places to understand how we can tackle this. So very excited to hear from Kimberly and her perspective, and she's coming to us, as I said, from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Kimberly.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here today. I just have to thank TJ McGuire in particular. He reached out. I know that he had invited me last year and I wasn't able to attend. And I'm really thankful that you all decided to do this conference virtually this year. And also wanted to say that I feel like this is just a really great curated panel. I think this is the first time that I have been on a panel that was majority Black, not just people of color, panel on placemaking and Halifax, Nova Scotia, nonetheless. So I think that's great. I've really enjoyed all the panelists and Uytae learning about you. So not only is it majority people of color, it also really focused a lot on housing. So I just think that the panels have been very well curated. I sat in on the first session earlier and listened to some of the experts talk about climate change and environmental justice. And again, that was an excellent talk. So I'm gonna round y'all out today and I'm gonna talk about a bit about myself and then really my new roles. So I wanted to start really by just talking a little bit about who I am. I rarely start talks by being personal, but I thought it was important and to take Jay's quote, placemaking is personal. That's so true. And I'm going to have to take that, Jay, from you. And in that vein, to talk about who I am, because it certainly drives my work and my approach and my philosophy to placemaking. So, really quickly, I'm a Jersey girl, born and raised in New Jersey. I spent my entire childhood in suburban New Jersey in a small town about 45 minutes outside of New York City, a place called North Brunswick. And it was textbook suburbia, very homogeneous in terms of the community, predominantly white area. And but my parents were from the city. My mother is from Baltimore. My dad was from a small city, Chester, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. And but they chose to raise their family, my sisters and I, in New Jersey, primarily for quality of life opportunities and reasons. And I'm a Gen Xer. So I'm a kid that grew up in the 70s and 80s. And that's when cities really weren't so popular. But I was always attracted to cities. I was always attracted to the multicultural aspects of cities, and quite frankly, the density. I always found the city to be interesting. I was in Baltimore a lot as a child. I was in Washington, D.C., and I spent most of my time when I wasn't in New Jersey, in New York City. And so New York in the 80s was also a time of great inequality. And I saw homelessness front and center. I just saw the disparities of the very high income, very wealthy folks and folks that really weren't doing so well. And I was just a very curious child and wanted to know, why did that inequality exist? Why was there such vast differences in living conditions in America, in the US? So that actually drove my drive and my interest in city planning. I actually went to school for public policy, urban policy. So I understood a lot of the things that Albus presented around why. So The Color of Law is an excellent book. I learned that back in college and graduate school. But the built environment was a complete enigma to me. I didn't understand architects and urban designers because they were really focused on form and function and less about people. So I made a pivot in my career and really started working directly with cities in city government and specifically in urban planning and development. I have 20 years of experience in both Washington, D.C. and Detroit. I've worked in all sectors, but it is significant to note that I spent the majority of my time in city government. And I have a special love for city government, for local work. I think it's extremely difficult. I think that it's the most challenging environment because you have so many factors, not just first and foremost the residents that you're serving, but also a political agenda at times that can sometimes be at odds with what is best for residents. So you see the specialties there. I'm not going to read them off, but I will say that placemaking is an interesting term. I'd say that it's been a practice that's been around long before the term. And like all of the speakers today, you come at it from different perspectives and different disciplines. But at the end of the day, it's really about community and making your communities better and thinking about the connections to place. And just personally, my love of arts and culture, travel, and yes, soccer actually help drive my work. So just a quick facts about DC for those who are unfamiliar. I wanted to just give you some comparisons because I am a little bit of a data geek. In 2000, our population was just under 600,000. We were 572. We stand today around 700,000 people. And I think the census will show that we're probably closer to around 720,000. It's a city that was majority Black back in 2000. It is not today. To my right, you'll see the statistics on race. I'd say today it's a very racially balanced city. African Americans, about 47%. We were 60% in 2000. So that is a significant decrease. We'll go into some of those reasons, but I think that it's not all due to gentrification. The DC region is also home of the largest Black middle class in the United States, maybe outside of Atlanta. I don't know, we trade off between 1 and 2. And so some of the change in statistics for the Black population wasn't due to gentrification, but Black middle class moving out of the city. And that was particularly true in the 90s and early 2000s and moving out to Prince George's County. So gentrification is a nuanced story in DC. Just look at some of the household income numbers. You can see that the household income has increased significantly over the last 20 years. The housing composition has not. It's largely remained the same in terms of renters versus owners. It's more renters than owners. And today it's about almost 60% renters. And that is, that's an issue in a high market city where rents are escalating, and it sets up the reason why the Washington Housing Conservancy exists. And I will get to that in a few minutes. And really just some stats on the rate of displacement in the city. You heard from Tamika Butler earlier today out of LA, and the US cities that have experienced the most widespread displacement of low income residents is LA and DC. And some of these stats, again, they're really quite alarming. And it's one of the main reasons why I came back to my adopted home to help think about and try to solve some of the problems around displacement. So I wanted to give you my philosophy on placemaking. You know, this is, again, these presentations are not planned, but I'm going to touch on a lot of the things that the previous speakers spoke upon a little bit earlier. But first and foremost, it's people focused. It's not just about the built environment. Architects, landscape architects, and even some urban planners, they focus has traditionally been around form and function of buildings and space, and not focused on the people that inhabit those spaces. I know that sounds a bit crazy, but that's the training traditionally of architecture schools. That has changed in the last 10 years, and it's become more human-centered, more people-centered. But historically, it has been about buildings and not people. And really focusing on people who live in the spaces, in the places that you're designing for, and really giving priority to people's lived experience. That's the residents' lived experience. So we're planning with and not for community. Co-creation, I'm a strong believer in that. And that has been a radical shift in the profession, and that seeding over that you don't know everything going into a community, and that the people who live there are actually the ones that are most informed and actually have some of the best ideas around how to improve community. And that makes a lot of sense. Be curious, creative, and collaborative, the 3 C's, as I like to call it. I really focused on these 3 things when I was in city government. City government, while I really enjoyed my time there, it can be a quite frustrating place because government is very bureaucratic, and sometimes people aren't thinking outside of the box and, you know, just accepting things as the status quo, or this is the way that we've always done them. So I found that you had to be creative in your solutions with government. And sometimes that sounds like an oxymoron. I just happened to work for some very dynamic, creative, visionary leaders and bosses while I was in city government, both in DC and Detroit. And it really takes that creativity to really move the dial and change outcomes for residents in a city. And it really is the government's responsibility to bring that. I added collaborative mainly because government is notoriously siloed and agencies don't always speak to each other, or there's fiefdoms within government, and really want to break those down and work across agencies and across disciplines is so important and so critical to the work. In addition to being working across agencies, also thinking interdisciplinary or across disciplines within the profession and outside of the profession. Planners and architects and landscape architects have a particular point of view, and it's valid, but our communities are challenged beyond the skill sets of these professions. And I strongly believe bringing in community activists, human service workers, mental health workers, like social workers and educators are truly needed in planning processes, because in a lot of our communities, especially communities of color, especially low-income communities, we're dealing with a lot of trauma. And I believe that you have to be able to heal, to be able to envision a different future for yourself. So those are really key things that I've learned over the course of my career to make successful, meaningful change in places. Which leads me to my next point of recognizing your blind spots. By definition, a blind spot is something you can't see. So how are you supposed to recognize it? You recognize your blind spots by surrounding yourself around people who don't think like you, who bring different perspectives, have different experiences that can help push you in your thinking and your approach to how you're solving a problem. Everyone has blind spots, including myself, but it's the ability and the humility to recognize that you don't know everything and that you need people around you that think differently to help push innovation that's so critical in placemaking. And I find it's incredibly important. And lastly, going outside your comfort zone. This is really just about pushing your boundaries, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. And that is not, I'm not talking about physical danger. What I'm talking about is we have a tendency to hang out with the people that we like and the people that we know. And that doesn't necessarily always push growth and understanding and empathy. My life has been a series of pushing outside my comfort zone, being in environments that didn't look like my own, being in schools that challenged me, choosing things that I wasn't naturally good at, helped me grow as an individual. And it's something that I bring to the field when I'm thinking about people and residents. You have to have that ability to step outside of your circumstances and yourself to be a more empathetic placemaker and planner. So I went to the punchline first with inclusive, my philosophy. I want to now turn to my current job and how all of those things really come together. And as I said, I spent the majority of my career in city government. I have recently left the city of Detroit, where I spent 3 amazing, challenging years working for the city of Detroit and returned home to Washington, D.C. I am leading the Washington Housing Conservancy, which is a new not-for-profit. And we were established in 2018. We're a response to the market. And we bring private sector real estate expertise and capital with a social impact mission to prevent displacement and preserve housing, affordable housing, offering low and middle income workers rent stability and the opportunity to thrive and build wealth. To be very clear, we are a model that's disrupting the market. We deal in the naturally occurring affordable housing space. So this is privately owned real estate, and it's also unsubsidized, meaning it doesn't rely on government subsidy like Section 8, 108 loans, or the low-income housing tax credits. Many of the financing tools that build the majority of affordable housing stock in the US, we do not rely on. We rely, and I'll talk about our financing in a few minutes. Our main mission is preserving long-term affordability. And we're also not doing new construction. We are a preservation model. We are looking at existing mixed income apartment buildings in the DC region. So that's in the city and throughout the area. And we have a mission, a social impact mission of promoting economic mobility, particularly for low income and moderate income African Americans and other people of color. Specifically, we know that traditional affordable housing, while it preserves and gives a person housing, it often limits one's ability to make money. We call it the housing cliff. If you go outside the income band, you often lose the housing. We think that that's a false choice. We believe that you should be able to have long-term affordability without the income restrictions that would prevent you from improving your quality of life for you and your family and moving up the social and economic mobility ladder. So we are quite innovative and ambitious in what we're trying to do. I'm going to speed up in the interest of time to make sure that I get to some of the key things. But we are looking at preserving 3,000 units, again, of naturally occurring housing, affordable workforce housing. We're looking at high impact locations across the country or across the region, and I'll talk about those in a few minutes. I talked a little bit, this is our theory of change, and you see right in the middle, our North Star is really around housing stability and service of being able to allow residents the comfort and the ease of thinking about building wealth for their family, and thinking that the long-term affordability that usually comes with home ownership, we're proposing for our rental properties and for the people living in our properties. We hope to achieve our North Star of housing stability and economic mobility by 4 key strategies: inclusive property management, human capital development, creative placemaking, and community building. Going to really focus on placemaking, and really the key here is that it's not, again, just about the space and the built environment, but really about creating and fostering a deeper sense of place, cultural preservation, and well-being. We feel that these 4 strategies are critical to enabling people to be successful residents, and really thinking about wealth building and wealth creation in our communities. We also plan on holding ourselves accountable. This is a draft of some of the metrics and some of the things that we're developing in our social impact strategy based on the 4 key strategies. And our operating principles, advancing racial equity inclusion front and center. Albus talked about this in depth around the structural racism that exists in our country. And that's front and center in the work. And you have to acknowledge it and have it front and center to be successful, maximizing resident choice and voice, and being adaptable. And these are some of the statistics around the rental market and the rent burden. 45% of renters now spend more than 30% of their earnings on housing. And more than 72,000 households fall into that affordability gap, meaning they make too much to qualify for traditional affordable housing, but they don't make enough to meet, to be able to live successfully in the area without being severely rent burdened. And this is just going to get worse given what we're experiencing with COVID, and we're seeing increasing unemployment. We're seeing the benefits and protections expiring with respect to housing. And we see that people are not able to pay their rent, and that's increasing at alarming rates. I will just take a few more minutes just to talk about our structure. We have a social impact investing pool, and they provide the second debt or mezzanine financing. The Conservancy, which is the organization that I run, is a not-for-profit, and we will be the owners and operators of the real estate. We also will be leading the social impact strategy. We have 16 million funds raised to date, and our goal is 30 million to be self-sustaining. And we also plan to create a stakeholder council that will help with advocacy around affordable housing and workforce, and in this naturally occurring affordable housing space. The typical deal structure for our social impact pool money, you'll see that the point of this slide is just to show you really quickly how we finance our projects. One, it's a traditional mortgage is the first loan, then the impact pool provides mezzanine financing, and the Conservancy provides equity up to 10%. And this is just a look at some of the investors in the social impact pool that offers a 7% return to investors. And you'll see that it's corporations, philanthropy, banks, primarily. We've raised 110 million, and our goal is 150 for us to be self-sustaining. And I talked a bit about where we're working, and Albus talked a lot about this, and so did Uytae, around where affordable housing tends to be located. We are actually looking at locations that have above average population growth, that are in areas that are close to employment centers, that have large rental housing stock available, that are mixed income. These are areas that are really hot right now, and that the naturally occurring affordable housing is at threat of being lost due to the growing pressure on the market. And we know that place really dictates outcomes. So we are working, those blue blobs represent where we're working in the region. And you'll see that most of them are along high quality transit, which is subway or high quality bus lines in the DC area. And I'm just going to end on the transformative trends that we hope to accomplish over time. And these transformative trends, really preventing displacement, would be amazing. And displacement is already occurring. We're hoping to help mitigate the rate and the impact with our intervention, creating and keeping neighborhoods diverse racially and economically, and creating more equitable systems. The last few slides, which will be available, are really just about how we work and just the cross collaboration. And I wanted to just share that we are working with consultants, the Center for Mixed Income Communities, which is based in Case Western University in Cleveland. They are one of the preeminent researchers on mixed income communities and mixed income housing, and they've been guiding our strategy work. So with that, I'm gonna stop right there, stop sharing my screen. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Kimberly. That was great. I want to learn more about what you're doing and how we can apply that in Halifax and other cities. So placemaking is personal. City building is divine. You need to understand the history. You need to identify allies and accomplices. You need to stop empowering people. People already have the power. And you need to go outside your comfort zone. Those are a few of the things that I jotted down during this amazing session. We're unfortunately, time is slipping away very quickly. We're committed to go to quarter after. I'm trying to avoid using specific time zones. Quarter after the hour, unless you're in Newfoundland, in which case it's quarter to the next hour or whatever. Anyway, you'll figure it out when your screen goes dark. But until then, we're looking forward to having a conversation with all the panelists. I believe we've lost Rodney, who had a previous commitment, so couldn't stick around for the panel, but we have our other panelists. And I know you can't hear the cheering. I heard the cheering here in our little room. We've got about 5 people here, and people were cheering at home. So thank you very much for the words of wisdom. And let's see if we can have a little conversation. We may only have time for one question, so I'm going to try and make it a good one that you can all dig into. And so as we talk about this session, we're talking a lot about, the lack of engagement. This is something that's of concern, I think, to all of us. And as we've been thinking about this and talking to different people that are involved in engagement, even at its best, public engagement often involves, well-meaning city staff who may or may not be really aware of any sort of historical context. They may be new or junior. Typically, you've got a developer that's involved. That developer is there because they want to make money. That's why they got into that business in the first place. You've got a community, oftentimes a community that feels left out, that maybe has been left out for decades and generations, who has been ignored. And so you've got perhaps lack of empathy from the city side. You've got distrust from the community side. So given all that, for most of these projects, give us your ideas. How do we do a better job at engagement? And I would challenge you to be specific. How do we do better at this? Let's start with Jay, and then we'll go around. I want to get everyone's thoughts on this. Oh, and make sure you turn off your mute.
Here we are. So what I would say very quickly is to ensure that engagement does not happen in the city hall or state buildings. Take it to the streets, take it to the places where the development or the design is actually going to happen. Make it an embodied experience. You talked about people not, and I'll give you a very clear example. You spoke about people not always knowing the history, or what we would say is the cultural heritage, the intangible cultural heritage of a particular site. That would mean the rituals, the practices, sometimes the trauma, the celebration, the assets of a particular place. And one of the things that I always do is that I begin by leading a public walk, and I get people who live in the location to be at different stations. So they build, they do the research, they bring forward the oral history, they go and they do further research and they bring that forward, and we create a map around their place-based knowledge, and we take the community out to walk and roll with those individuals. And so we begin not with myself or my team at the front of the room. We always begin in place, centering the people who have local knowledge and expertise, using an embodied experience and storytelling.
Great. Who wants a piece of that?
I just want to echo and second and amen what Jay just said. I think the issue with that is getting people to engage in a process. I think it's more than just meeting, and this is meeting people where they are. Oftentimes, planning doesn't rise to the level of like critical. It's not what's at the forefront of people's minds when they're dealing with a lot of things. And so my experience has been about really trying to, especially when you're engaged in like long-term planning, it's very hard when you have immediate needs and things that you're dealing with. So the challenge is, I think, for us to make it relevant. And it might sound obvious to a lot of the panelists and the participants about how relevant planning is, but it's actually a really abstract term, and it's not something that it can get really wonky really quick. So I'll just say that the non-traditional, the storytelling, the things that Jay mentioned, I think are really critical, but also like where you're holding these meetings, like and we held meetings in people's backyards. It doesn't get any more personal than when a resident invites you into their home to have a government meeting or a planning meeting to talk about a project that is happening in their neighborhood. And so we go, when I work for the city, to where people are, and that could be cafes, that could be parks, that can be residential buildings, having people host you. Again, I think I mentioned co-creation, and I really believe in that. It is, I mean, I do feel that planners bring value, but I do feel that the lived experience must be respected, and it must be part of, if not, that's where you start. And I think that a lot of times we're not good listeners. We might say that we are, but I don't necessarily think the professional, we think we know the answers. So I stress humility. It's something that I've grown into over the course of my career. When I was younger, I definitely was more arrogant about what I thought I knew. And it really, you have to step outside yourself and respect and bring a sense of respect and really listen before you start to go about the work. So I'll just pause there.
I think these are real good thoughts. And, because I've worn every hat, right? The community organizing hat, the city hat, and now the development hat. It's really interesting. Here's what I say. One is, if you have a plan, if you come into a situation or project, you say you have a plan, you're already starting behind. Outreach is is a formation and growing every day. There is new ideas, new communities, new contextual realities that you need to understand. Secondly, I think from a city perspective, planners are very technical in nature. And one of the things that we've talked about when I was at the city is that you've got to leave the technical IQ, everything you've learned at your university at the door. Just leave it there. This is about the EQ. This is the emotional quotient. This is the understanding of how a community works. This is individuals in the community. You will get cussed out, right? In a real community. And so, like, allow yourself to experience that. And if you can get there, now that's the beginning of what we're starting with. And I think, lastly, I would just say that it's a bottom-up approach. And I think everyone has kind of mentioned that here, that we really want to start from the places. We want to start from the rec centers. We want to start bringing the youth groups, the churches, the things like that, where there's already access points and connection points, and learn from those folks and start to present some of the things that we're trying to, some feedback we're trying to get.
I guess I have the last word. There's no pressure. But I can't really expand too much on what the other panelists have said. Really, important stuff to say. I mean, of course, I'm the video guy. I make videos on urban planning. I think, of course, videos are a great tool to educate people on what's going on. Another little hot take. I think we should stop using the term like shape your city. Nobody knows what that means. Just tell people what's going on. But I have a bit of a hot take. Maybe I thought about this just for a second. Knowing that the context of this conversation is around inclusion, I think it's not good enough to just think about an inclusive process. I think we should really be looking for inclusive outcomes. Planners, as professionals, we know the exclusion that exists in our history, in our policies. I think we should, as professionals, I'm not a professional, I'm sorry. I have a planning degree, but I ended up going into journalism, so I guess I can't call myself that. But, I think as professionals, you should have the courage to really reconsider and possibly repeal some of these policies, these things. Get rid of single family housing zoning. That's my hot take, and that's it.
I think I just want to add something to that. Let's go beyond inclusion and actually hit some justice. This is where the profession needs to go. So, it's sort of slowly rolling up on inclusion. That's pretty 1987. We need to jump into 2020, and going forward, we need to be trending toward justice and equity.
You're here.
It's fascinating. The importance of the language that we use and how different words really resonate differently with different people, even between, we've had conversations between the US and Canada. It's fascinating. So we're unfortunately at the end of our time. I want to leave with the very short snapper for each of you. So we seem to be living through at least 4 simultaneous crises at the moment: a health one, an economic one, a racial one, and a climate one. And there's probably more that I'm forgetting. On a scale of, in a 1-sentence answer, on a scale of 1 to 10, how optimistic do you feel about the future of our cities, and why? You can go in any order that you like.
I'm a pragmatic optimist, and this hill is one that I'm really willing to die on. And so, I think that there is an uprising and a movement of other people who are prepared to do the same. So it's not so much optimism, it's more of an unyielding, unrelenting, indomitable approach to ensure that change happens.
Who wants to follow that?
I mean, I agree with Jay. I am pro-city. I have always been. I think that this time it is a bit different, mainly because of what I've been seeing outside of cities. And when I look at small suburban, predominantly white communities that have been marching for Black Lives Matter, and how long the protests have lasted. This is months, not a day, not a week. So I feel like there's sustained momentum. And I think that the movement is bigger than just the folks that have been leading the fight, which are Black and brown people. I feel like we're finally seeing our white allies and our white folks join us in more meaningful ways. So I feel optimistic, but I'm an optimistic person. I'm pragmatic, but I'm always going to look at the glass half full versus half empty.
I'm optimistic as well. So you got some optimistic, pragmatic folks. And I'll just say that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. And we believe in better days are ahead, especially for our city.
As a journalist, I think I tend to be more of a pessimist and I tend to look for issues and problems to highlight. But I know that all of that is in service of really trying to improve our cities. And I think that's like what we've done today. Coming out of this feeling super, super grateful and inspired by the conversations we've had. Thank you so much for hosting it, Paul.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to thank all of you. This has been inspiring and educational and challenging. Thank you so much for participating. Of course, we have to thank our supporters and sponsors before we depart. So big thanks to Develop Nova Scotia, Port of Halifax, the Downtown Halifax Business Commission, Halifax Partnership, Canadian Urban Institute, as well as the Province of Nova Scotia, National Public Relations, Urban Capital, Turner Drake, it's a company, not a person. Maybe it's a person too, I don't know. Halifax Stanfield Airport, Placemaking X, RAD Consulting, FBM Architects, and MP Andy Fillmore, who is a person. I want to thank you again. Thank you everyone for participating. And we do have another session that's coming up. We're taking a brief break now. Our next session is happening at 5 o'clock Eastern time. That's 6 o'clock here in Atlantic, Canada. It's a conversation with Eric Kleinenberg. You don't want to miss that. Feel free to, it's later in the evening here, so, grab a beer or some wine. You can put on your pajama tops. I already know you're wearing pajama bottoms, and join us again in a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.